The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold foil, and bearing the Whitmore family crest, an ornate oak tree intertwined with scales of justice. It was elegant, traditional, and cold, the kind of invitation that didn't ask so much as it commanded attendance. It read, "You are cordially invited to the Whitmore family reunion and the 85th birthday celebration of the Honourable Judge Albert Whitmore, to be held at Waverly Hill Estate, July 14th through 16th. Marla Dawson sat alone at her kitchen table in Savannah, the card lying flat beside her teacup, untouched. Her fingers hovered over its edge, like she might burn herself. Outside, summer insects buzzed against the screen door, and the air was heavy with the scent of magnolia and memory. She hadn't seen Waverly Hill in over 4 decades. Not since she was a girl, trailing behind her mother Louise, through the back hallways of the grand Georgian manor where they were never meant to be seen, only heard if summoned. The corridors of her childhood were filled with polished floors, muffled voices, and the constant burden of invisibility. Now suddenly, she was invited back. There was no mention of her mother in the invitation, no acknowledgement of the years Louise had spent cleaning silver, pressing linens, whispering lullabies in the dark. Marla doubted the Whitmores remembered her at all, if they ever truly saw her in the first place. Still, she stared at the card, not with excitement, but with a quiet gathering resolve. It was more than curiosity that pulled her. There were questions left to rot in silence too long, ghosts that still wandered the halls of Waverly Hill. And though the invitation bore no kindness, no real welcome, it was a door, and this time, she would not knock quietly. She folded the card, placed it carefully in a drawer, and poured herself another cup of tea. The spoon clinked against porcelain like a distant bell, tolling not celebration, but reckoning. The gravel crunched under the tires of Marla Dawson's modest sedan as she pulled onto the long tree-lined drive of Waverly Hill. The estate rose in the distance, like a relic from another century, white columns gleaming in the Georgia sun, the wide veranda shadowed by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was a house built to impress, and more than that, to remind. She parked off to the side, away from the gleaming black SUVs and imported cars lined up in the circular drive, like a showroom of old southern wealth. A valet hesitated as she stepped out, perhaps unsure whether to take her keys or direct her to the staff entrance. Marla offered no explanation. She handed over her keys with calm finality, adjusted the pearl earring on her left lobe, and walked up the steps in her navy blue dress, simple, dignified, and tailored with purpose. Her heels tapped lightly against the flagstone, each step a quiet defiance. Inside, the air was thick with money and memory. Antique portraits lined the foyer walls, pale faces frozen in time, watching from their golden frames. Guests milled about, sipping champagne and speaking in polished tones. The moment Marla entered, a hush seemed to ripple around her, too faint to be called a silence, but noticeable all the same. Glances slid her way, and then quickly turned. Clarissa Whitmore spotted her first. "Oh," she said, blinking with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "You must be with catering." Marla smiled back, slow and steady. "No, I'm a guest. Marla Dawson. I'm here on behalf of my late mother, Louise Dawson." Clarissa's lips parted slightly, as if the name triggered some distant, unwanted memory, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head with the sort of practiced charm honed over decades of hosting fundraisers and managing appearances. "How touching," she said. "I suppose the judge extended the invitation out of nostalgia. He does get sentimental in his old age." Marla said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, her poise, her silence, was enough to unnerve. She was ushered inside with the kind of politeness that barely masked discomfort. Conversations resumed, but she could feel herself being circled, studied, filed away under curiosity and suspicion. No one remembered her. Not really. Not the girl with the soft curls and curious eyes, who used to carry her mother's cleaning caddy through the back corridors. But Marla remembered everything. As the butler took her small overnight bag, she paused at the foot of the grand staircase. Above it hung a massive oil painting of Judge Albert Whitmore in his prime, gavel in hand, jaw set like marble. She met the eyes of the painting without blinking. Then she climbed the stairs, one hand gliding along the banister. Her mother once polished every morning before sunrise. Waverly Hill was a house built on hierarchy, of power, bloodline, and secrets, each woven into its wallpaper, like the faded fleur-de-lis patterns in the formal parlour. Now, as the family trickled into the great room for cocktails and introductions, that hierarchy began to tremble under the weight of its own fractures. Marla sat quietly near the fireplace, sipping sweet tea from a crystal glass, watching as the Whitmores performed their subtle dance of disdain and detachment. The tension wasn't spoken aloud, not yet, but it hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Siblings snapped at one another over real estate ventures and trust funds. Cousins exchanged forced pleasantries while calculating inheritances behind practiced smiles. The eldest son, Barrett, a silver-haired real estate mogul, had barely spoken to his younger sister, Elaine, in years. Their feud over the family vineyard in Virginia had turned bitter after their mother's passing. Now they stood on opposite sides of the room, clinking glasses with strangers, instead of speaking to each other. Clarissa, the judge's daughter-in-law, floated from group to group like a social vulture, her designer dress clinging to her surgically preserved frame. She laughed too loudly at a comment from a guest, and then cast a glance toward Marla that was sharp enough to cut silk. Marla noticed it all. The smiles that didn't reach eyes, the coded language of power and exclusion. No one had outright asked why she was there, but the question clung to every greeting. A cousin named Lydia, barely in her 20s, and dressed in a linen jumpsuit that cost more than Marla's entire outfit, whispered to a friend, "I think she's with one of the charities grandfather donates to." Marla turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. Lydia flushed, mumbling something into her glass. At dinner, the seating chart told its own story. Marla's name was written at the far end of the long mahogany table, near the buffet and away from the chandelier's glow. The place settings grew finer, the closer one sat to the head of the table. Bone china for some, simple porcelain for others. Marla's plate was mismatched, an accident perhaps. She said nothing. As the meal progressed, old resentments bloomed like bruises. Barrett brought up a land sale Elaine had blocked. Elaine fired back with a veiled comment about Barrett's third wife and questionable ethics. Their children rolled their eyes, scrolling through phones under the table. Marla remained composed, her presence quiet but unyielding. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend her place at the table. She simply existed, and that was enough to disrupt the fragile illusion of family unity. When dessert was served, a pecan tart so sweet it stung the teeth, Judge Albert was wheeled in by a nurse. The room hushed. He looked around slowly, his eyes roomy but alert, offering nods to the usual suspects. He passed over Marla without acknowledgement, didn't nod, didn't blink. If he recognized her, he gave no sign. Clarissa leaned in toward him and whispered something that made his lip curl faintly. Disdain or confusion, it was hard to tell. Marla watched, her face unreadable. Inside she felt a slow tightening, like a thread being drawn through a needle, pulling taut. This was their house. But they didn't see the cracks forming beneath their feet. Not yet. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of southern gentility and unspoken hostility. Beneath the warm smiles and syrupy drawls, Marla felt the 1,000 paper cuts of exclusion that could not be traced to a single wound, but bled all the same. At brunch on the veranda, Marla arrived to find all the shaded seats taken. She stood for a moment with her plate, fluffy biscuits, and smoked trout mousse balanced delicately as eyes flicked toward her and then away. No one moved. Eventually, a server brought over a folding chair, metal, not wicker like the others, and placed it beside a ficus. Half in the sun, Marla sat without complaint, but not without noticing. When the family gathered for a group photo on the lawn, cousins in pastel, matriarchs in pearls, the photographer raised his camera and said, "Let's have just the immediate family for this one." Marla stepped aside, but Clarissa, arms linked with her son Chase, called out, "Let's not confuse things. We've got enough folks here as it is." Her laugh was crisp and calculated. No one corrected her. During cocktail hour, a tray of champagne flutes floated through the room, deftly offered to every guest but one. The server passed by Marla twice without a glance. When she finally flagged down another and asked for sparkling water, the glass arrived lukewarm. At one point, a group gathered around Clarissa as she recounted a story from a fundraising gala in Atlanta. You wouldn't believe the people who showed up. Honestly, sometimes charity work feels like performance art. You invite them in, dress them up, feed them caviar, and they still act like they belong. Laughter bubbled around her. Only one person, a teenage niece named Hannah, glanced toward Marla, her brow slightly furrowed. But she said nothing. Even Judge Albert played his part in the theater of erasure. When Marla passed him in the hallway, he stared at her with the vacant scrutiny of someone trying to place a face from decades ago. Finally, he muttered to the nurse beside him, "We should ask housekeeping not to wander through the main wing." Marla's breath caught, but her face remained composed. It was not the mistake that stung. It was the ease with which he made it. Later that evening, she retreated to the garden, needing the quiet. Fireflies blinked lazily over the hydrangeas. The distant hum of conversation and clinking glasses wafted from the house. She stood beneath the arbor where her mother once trimmed roses for the judge's wife and imagined Louise's hands, calloused and careful, moving through the same branches. She closed her eyes. The cruelties here were not loud. They did not bruise skin, but they echoed through glances, through absences, through the way no one ever asked, "Who are you really?" And yet, Marla endured. Not with silence born of weakness, but of patience. Because the house had forgotten her, but it would remember. The Whitmores spared no expense for the judge's birthday gala. The ballroom at Waverly Hill glittered beneath towering crystal chandeliers. A jazz quartet played near the French doors, the notes lilting like smoke through the air. Silver trays held oysters and carved tenderloin, and the Whitmore women swept through the room in gowns that shimmered like frost. Marla wore navy blue, simple, elegant, unadorned. Her mother's locket, her only jewelry. She stood near the edge of the room, sipping club soda, her eyes quietly watching as conversations spiraled around money, legacy, and carefully manicured lies. The judge was wheeled into thunderous applause, seated like royalty beneath a gilded banner that read, "Albert Whitmore, 85 years of honor and legacy." Toasts followed, flowery tributes from grandchildren, sycophantic praise from a local senator, and a saccharine poem read by Clarissa, who dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She made sure everyone saw. Then came the bourbon. As the evening wore on, the air loosened with drink. Voices rose. Laughter rang sharp and sudden, and the masks began to slip. Marla remained at a distance, smiling faintly, sipping slowly, content to let the tide pass around her, until Nathan spoke. Nathan Whitmore, second cousin, 3 bourbons in, his bow tie dangling around his neck like a surrender flag, sidled up to a small circle of younger guests. He was always the loud one, the unfiltered one, the one who said the thing everyone else only thought. "You'll see her," he slurred, gesturing not so subtly toward Marla. "Over there in the corner, real regal, like she's holding court." Laughter. Nervous. Uncertain. He went on. "Mama used to say that Louise Dawson, her mum, kept that house cleaner than a preacher's soul, and that her daughter, what was her name? Marcia, used to follow her around like a little shadow. Funny to see the help grow up and come back with pearls and airs." Silence fell like a stone in a still pond. A fork clinked against a plate. Someone cleared their throat. One cousin murmured, "Nathan, maybe tone it down." But it was too late. Marla turned slowly, not to confront, but simply to acknowledge. Her gaze met Nathan's across the room. Calm, level, unreadable. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. She simply set her glass down on the nearest table, walked with quiet dignity toward the doors, and left the ballroom without a word. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor. Not rushed, not ashamed. A queen leaving a court unworthy of her presence. And as the doors swung closed behind her, the room filled with the unease of those who knew they had seen something important. Something they didn't yet understand. Behind the thick walls of Waverly Hill, a storm had broken, but the thunder was silent. The morning after the gala dawned grey and humid, heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Fog rolled across the wide lawn of Waverly Hill, like a ghost returning home. Inside the estate, silence clung to the corridors, an aftermath, an unasked question hanging in the air. At precisely 10 o'clock, the family gathered in the judge's private library, a room lined with mahogany shelves and the scent of old tobacco and older pride. The fireplace was cold, but the tension in the room gave off its own heat. No one mentioned Marla, not out loud, not yet. The family lawyer, Gerald Strickland, stood at the head of the room, dressed in a charcoal suit and holding a thick leather folder. He was old school, a man who had served the Whitmores for decades. His loyalty forged in retainer fees and silence. Clarissa Whitmore sat near the front, her spine ramrod straight, pearl necklace stiff against her throat. She gripped her husband's arm, her mouth set in a line that dared anyone to challenge her place. Around her, cousins, nephews, and siblings filled the room with forced solemnity, all of them thinking the same thing. The estate was finally about to be divided, and then Marla entered. She wore cream slacks and a soft grey blouse, her hair pulled back, her posture poised, no apology in her step, no fear, just calm grace, the kind that unnerved people who confused quiet with weakness. Some heads turned, most didn't. A few narrowed their eyes. She took an empty seat near the edge of the room, neither hiding nor demanding to be seen. Strickland cleared his throat. Per Judge Albert Whitmore's explicit instructions, we will now proceed with the reading of his final, an updated will, signed and notarized 3 days prior to his birthday. A murmur rustled through the crowd. Strickland opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The formalities came first. Standard bequests to minor relatives, a few donations to charities, a scholarship fund in the judge's alma mater. The room grew restless. Eyes flicked to watchers, legs shifted. The big news, everyone knew, was coming, and then it did. With respect to the primary estate of Judge Albert Whitmore, including all holdings, investments, liquid assets, and the ancestral property of Waverly Hill, it is the Judge's will that said estate be bequeathed in full to Ms. Marla Dawson. The silence was immediate, deafening. Clarissa blinked. Once, then again, as though the words needed time to register. Gerald continued. It is further stated that this decision is irrevocable and final, and was made in full capacity of mind, and witnessed by two neutral parties. Clarissa stood abruptly. This is absurd. Strickland didn't flinch. The will is valid and legally binding. It was signed in my presence. A chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor as someone stood to object. But no words came. Just disbelief. Rage. Confusion. Marla remained seated, hands clasped in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her expression was unreadable. Her gaze steady. She must have manipulated him, someone whispered. Blackmail, said another. Strickland raised a hand. There is one final component. Per the judge's instruction, a sealed letter is to be read aloud now, by Ms. Dawson herself. He reached into the folder and handed Marla the envelope. All eyes turned to her. She accepted it calmly, her hand steady as she broke the seal. Inside was a single page, folded neatly. She opened it, paused, and then began to read. Her voice, when it came, was clear, steady, carried not by vengeance, but by truth. My name is Albert Whitmore, she read, and what I am about to say is long overdue. For a moment after Marla finished reading the first line of Judge Albert's letter, the library was suspended in time, soundless, breathless. Then, like thunder rolling across a valley, the storm hit. Clarissa was the first to erupt. This is insanity, she snapped, leaping to her feet. He was manipulated. There's no other explanation. He was old, confused, probably drugged. Her voice cracked with rage, not grief. Her husband, Henry, tugged at her sleeve, but she shook him off. Eyes locked on Marla like a lioness circling a trespasser. Across the room, others joined the chorus of disbelief. A younger cousin with slicked back hair muttered, "She must have forged it." An aunt gasped, "This isn't legal. Gerald, say something." While an older uncle asked under his breath, "Who the hell even is she?" Strickland didn't move. His silence said everything. Marla folded the letter gently, setting it on her lap. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. The truth didn't need her to shout it. It had already been spoken. Her calm only deepened the Whitmore's fury. "She's nothing," Clarissa screamed. Her southern charm finally peeled back to its core. "She is a ghost from the kitchen, a maid's child pretending to be, what, one of us?" Her words sliced through the air like broken glass. But Marla remained still, dignified, unshaken. "She didn't even know him," someone else shouted. Strickland, finally stirring, raised a hand again. "Enough. The judge's instructions are clear. The estate belongs to Ms. Dawson. The rest of his letter will clarify why." He turned to Marla. "Whenever you're ready, Ms. Dawson." Marla nodded slowly, picked up the letter once more, and resumed reading. Her voice never faltered as she gave breath to the judge's confession. "I once told myself I was a man of principle, but in truth, I was a coward. I loved a woman I could never publicly claim. Louise Dawson, your mother, was not a secret to me. She was my sanctuary. My shame was not loving her, but hiding her, and hiding you." The room stilled, like a balloon that had been pricked mid-air. Only the sound of quiet breathing and the distant creak of the house settling could be heard. Clarissa sank back into her seat, her expression unreadable now, something between horror and disbelief. Henry lowered his gaze. A few others looked away completely, unwilling to meet the reality in Marla's eyes. The words from the judge's letter continued, each line peeling back the rot beneath generations of southern gentility. I left you both behind to protect a reputation I now see was never worth the cost. I watched you grow from afar, saw the strength you inherited from your mother, and the grace I never earned. I could not die without setting this right, not just for you, but for this family that has hidden behind legacy and lineage, all the while denying the truth standing in front of them. When she finished the page, Marla looked up. No one spoke. No one could. The room that had once questioned her right to even be there now sat in silence. Before the truth that had always been theirs to face, she did not weep. She did not smirk. She simply folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and rested her hands in her lap. The power had shifted, not in noise or declaration, but in quiet revelation, and the storm, now fully upon them, would not be leaving anytime soon. The room was heavy with the weight of Judge Albert's words. But it was only when the last echo of silence stretched too long that the real unraveling began. Marla, having finished reading the letter, allowed the weight of its truth to settle over the family. Before she spoke again, she felt the pulse of the Whitmore legacy behind her, their shocked and crumbling faces, and knew that what had been hidden in the folds of time could never be buried again. Clarissa, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and disbelief, stood up with shaking hands. You think you can just take everything from us? Her voice cracked, but there was venom in her every syllable. That man, your father, wasn't some martyr. He was ours. And you're going to just waltz in here and take his name like it's nothing? Her words were like darts, but they didn't reach Marla. The anger wasn't hers to absorb anymore. The truth had claimed the space between them all, and nothing could undo what had been revealed. You don't get to walk in here and erase everything he built. You don't get to rewrite history. Clarissa's voice rose with each accusation. The venom of 100 years of inherited pride broke loose in her chest. This is our family's legacy, our birthright. Marla's eyes, calm and unyielding, met Clarissa S. with a stillness that seemed almost too perfect, in contrast to the frenzy unraveling around her. You're right, Marla finally spoke, her voice carrying with an almost unsettling calmness. This is your birthright, but it's my truth, and the truth cannot be owned by those who deny it. Clarissa recoiled, her chest rising and falling with seething breaths. She looked away, almost as if trying to shake the words from her skin. The air between them crackled with the clash of generations, of bloodlines, histories, and power. But it wasn't the fight Marla had come for. Around her, the family was in disarray. Some, who had been silent until now, were muttering to one another, too afraid to speak up, too appalled by the enormity of the moment. They had lived their lives under the illusion of this house's grandeur, its untouchable history. And now, as the veil was torn away, they didn't know what to hold on to. Is this some kind of joke? Gerald, an older cousin who had been quiet until now, muttered, his voice betraying his desperation for this to not be real. A maid's child inheriting everything? A black woman? His words were poisoned with more than just disbelief. They were laced with the venom of old Southern prejudices, so thick they could suffocate the air. The room tensed, a collective breath held, waiting for Marla to respond. And she did, but not with the outrage they expected. She stood slowly, her hands folded in front of her, poised and steady as ever. No, this is not a joke. This is the legacy your patriarch built in the shadows of his own guilt. A legacy of power, control, and denial. And now it belongs to me. There was no triumph in her tone, no bitterness, Just the quiet, steady rhythm of a woman who had come to terms with a past none of them could fathom, but all of them would now have to accept. Marla's gaze swept the room, lingering on each of them, daring them to understand. Your father left me everything, not out of pity, but out of a deep-seated guilt. A guilt that he couldn't bear, and one that twisted the rest of his life. For years he abandoned me and my mother, his love, and his responsibility. But he could not die without making this right. There was no grand emotion behind her words, no flourish or anger, just a quiet statement of fact. She looked at Strickland, who was watching her intently, his brow furrowed. She knew he had been an unwilling witness to this storm, to the revelation that had ripped the Whitmore legacy apart. Finally, she turned her gaze to the window, out toward the sprawling estate that now awaited her claim. It felt strangely fitting. This house, so steeped in secrets, had become the stage for her own redemption. Her mother's memory, long buried in shame, had found its way back to the light. Judge Whitmore was not the man you think he was, she added, her voice softer now, almost reflective. He was a man of contradictions, of love and shame, and despite his flaws, he did love me. And now I have a chance to honor that love by giving this house and everything it represents new meaning. Clarissa's fury finally boiled over in a harsh, guttural sob. You can't do this, she cried, the brittle mask of politeness finally cracking. You'll ruin us all. But Marla wasn't listening anymore. She had already come to terms with the costs. The truth was here, in full light, and in that light, the Whitmores would have to learn what it meant to stand in the presence of something they had long sought to erase. Marla turned back toward them, her posture regal. I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to take what's mine, to finally belong to the place that was always meant for me. And there's nothing any of you can do to stop it. As the room sank into deep silence, the reality of the moment pressed down on them all. The Whitmores, for all their wealth, power, and name, could not undo what had been done. And as Marla stood before them, not as a guest, but as an heir, she realized that the only thing left to do was to walk away from the past and forward into the future she had long deserved. The air inside the grand dining hall felt thick with a heavy, almost suffocating silence as the Whitmore family began to process the bombshell that had just shattered their entire world. Marla stood there, her gaze unwavering, as the chaos simmered beneath the surface of their stunned expressions. No one moved, no one dared to speak, until the dam broke. Clarissa, her face an icy mask of fury, was the first to react. Her hands trembled at her sides, the polished veneer of her southern gentility cracking, revealing something darker beneath. You think this will make you welcome here? She spat, her voice hoarse with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. You think this house, this family, will accept you now because of some old letter written by a dying man? You're nothing but a stranger to us. The words cut through the air, sharp and venomous, but they didn't find their mark. Marla didn't flinch. She had seen this kind of contempt before, the type that festered in the shadows of southern homes, cloaked in the illusion of genteel hospitality, while its true venom brewed beneath the surface. She had lived with it her entire life. Clarissa, Judge Whitmore's eldest son, Edwin, said, his voice trembling as he stood up from the table. His face was pale, and his hands gripped the back of his chair, as though trying to hold himself together. We've all heard it. It's done. There's no changing this now. But Clarissa, whose ambitions had been so tightly bound to the Whitmore name, was beyond reason. Done? You think it's done? Her voice rose again, raw with emotion. Our whole lives, we've been taught that the Whitmore legacy is something sacred. We've protected it. We've lived it, breathed it. And now a woman, a maid's child, is going to take it all. Her words struck like a slap to the face, echoing with the weight of years of quiet resentments, the tension that had been building for decades. Edwin tried to step toward her, his voice soft but firm. "Clarissa, stop." But it was too late. The truth had already set the family's foundation crumbling beneath them. Marla didn't move. She had been silent through the tirade, letting each outburst fall like a stone into the water, rippling out, unsettling the calm surface of the Whitmore family's image. She looked around the room, taking in the array of emotions written on each face, the shock, the anger, the horror. But it was the grief she saw most clearly. It was the grief of a family that had lived in denial for too long, holding on to illusions of purity and legacy. And now, all that was left was the raw, jagged truth. "I don't expect you to understand," Marla said quietly, her voice now carrying an undertone of weariness. "And I don't expect your approval. But this inheritance is not just about money or property. It's about the truth coming to light, no matter how painful it is for you." Her words hit them like a wave, crashing into the fragile dam they had built to keep everything hidden. The truth, now fully exposed, was more than they could bear. Some of the family members turned their faces away, unable to face the reality that had just shattered their carefully constructed world. Others, like Strickland, were still processing the enormity of it all. But it was Marla's calm demeanor that seemed to unnerve them the most. Marla had already accepted the cost of this moment. It wasn't the inheritance that mattered anymore. It was the reclamation of her place, her mother's legacy, and the justice that had been so long denied to them both. Judge Whitmore's death had opened a door, and Marla wasn't afraid to walk through it. In fact, for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of liberation, the weight of the past finally lifting, leaving her free to embrace the future. "I don't need to be welcomed here," Marla continued, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "I'm already here. I always have been." A gasp escaped from one of the younger Whitmore cousins, a woman who had grown up hearing the family SS stories, but had never been taught the real one. "But how can this be?" she asked, her voice quivering. "How can we just accept this?" Marla's gaze softened as she looked at her, the only one in the room who seemed genuinely caught in the web of confusion. "You don't have to accept it. The truth isn't something you have to accept. It's just something that is." She let that hang in the air for a moment, watching as the rest of the family struggled to reconcile what they had just learned with the image they had so carefully cultivated of their father, their patriarch, their judge. The man they had revered as the embodiment of honor and dignity now stood revealed as a man of profound contradictions, someone who had built his life on secrets and lies. Clarissa's expression shifted for the briefest of moments, perhaps a flicker of understanding, of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by another wave of fury. She turned on her heel, storming out of the room, her footsteps echoing like a death knell through the grand halls of Waverly Hill. The rest of the family remained seated, caught in the aftermath of the revelation, unsure of what to do with the truth now that it was inescapable. But Marla was already walking toward the door, her shoulders squared, her heart as steady as it had ever been. She knew what she had to do. She had always known. And with that, she turned her back on them, her final words lingering in the room like a challenge. "This house belongs to me now, and I will make sure it honors my mother. Her truth will never be forgotten again." The last thing the family heard was the sound of her footsteps, distant but resolute, as she made her way down the long corridor that led to the future she had now claimed for herself. Behind her, the Whitmores sat in stunned silence, as if their entire world had crumbled, and perhaps In that moment, it had. The Whitmore family left in fragmented silence, each retreating into their own corners of disbelief, anger, and confusion. They no longer spoke of the celebration, nor did the laughter ever return to the grand halls of Waverly Hill. The birthday party had dissolved into a maelstrom of hurt and betrayal, the family torn apart by truths they had long avoided. The estate, once a symbol of their unwavering power and pride, now seemed to belong to the past, a past that could no longer shield them from the rawness of their own history. But Marla remained. While the storm of emotions raged inside the house, she walked its halls with a sense of calm, a quiet determination that seemed to settle over her like a cloak. She was no longer an outsider, no longer a stranger who had slipped into their world uninvited. This house, these walls, belonged to her now, by birthright, by truth, by the choices her father had failed to make when he should have. She made her way through the corridors of Waverly Hill with slow, deliberate steps. The walls, once filled with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to watch her. She stopped in front of one of them, a portrait of Judge Albert Whitmore himself, taken when he was much younger, standing tall and proud in his judicial robes. She studied the image. There was a coldness in his eyes, a hardness that she now knew was built on a foundation of secrets and lies. In the reflection of the glass, Marla saw herself, not just a woman in a house that had never belonged to her, but as a rightful heir to it, a bridge between the past and the future. Her fingers lightly traced the frame, but she didn't feel anger nor vengeance. Instead, she felt something closer to peace, a quiet understanding that this house, this legacy, was not hers to destroy, but to rebuild. At the far end of the hall, she stopped before a staircase leading to the upper floor. It was there she had spent countless hours as a child, unseen and unheard, a maid's daughter, who had been nothing more than an invisible presence in a house that had refused her. The echo of her mother's footsteps, her mother's quiet sighs as she worked, filled Marla's mind. Louise Dawson had loved this house. Despite the pain of living in its shadows, she had cherished it. And now, Marla would do the same. But she wouldn't do so as a servant. She wouldn't do so as a silent shadow in the background. She would do so as a woman of purpose, a woman of vision. With the money from her inheritance, Marla began to turn the estate into something new, a cultural center dedicated to preserving the stories of women, particularly women like her mother, whose lives had been overlooked, erased, and forgotten. She would transform Waverly Hill into a sanctuary, a place for young women to learn, to heal, and to find their own voices. It was a vision far removed from the old life the Whitmores had built, a life entrenched in wealth and control. It was a vision rooted in community, in empowerment, and in history. Marla spent her days in meetings with architects, historians, and local leaders, breathing new life into the old walls of Waverly Hill. She walked through the grand rooms, her mind already filled with ideas of how each space could serve a new purpose. The parlor would be turned into a gallery. The garden, once a private escape for the Whitmore family, would be a retreat for the young women who would live and learn within its walls. She would honor the past, but she would also create a future that was more inclusive, more compassionate, and more honest. Yet even as she worked to transform the estate, Marla never lost sight of the past, of the pain, the loss, and the generations of women who had walked these halls in silence. She often found herself sitting alone in the library, where the air smelled of old books and dust, reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the ghosts of her mother and father seemed to fill the empty spaces of the house, whispering to her, urging her on. But then, she would stand, and she would walk through the halls again, feeling the energy of the house shift with each step she took. Waverly Hill was no longer just a monument to a family's legacy. It had become something more. It had become a testament to survival, to resilience, and to the power of truth. And in that transformation, Marla found herself, not just as an heir, but as a woman who had carved out her place in a world that had long refused to acknowledge her. She had reclaimed her mother's legacy. She had given her own voice, the space it needed to rise, and she had given the world a new vision for what a family legacy could be. As Marla stood in the center of the library, the house quiet around her, she allowed herself a moment of peace. For the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of belonging. Not because she had been welcomed by those who had once turned their backs on her, but because she had built something of her own, something that would last long after the Whitmores had scattered, long after their old broken dreams had faded into the past. The future, Marla knew, belonged to those who were willing to rewrite the stories that had been told before. And as she looked out over the sprawling grounds of Waverly Hill, she could already see the horizon, one where history was no longer just written by the victors, but by the ones who had been overlooked, who had been forgotten, who had risen above it all to claim their place. This was her legacy now. This was her story. And it was only just beginning.